This is an account I didn't witness with my own eyes. I heard it all from the elders in my family. And to be honest, whenever I recall these tales, I can still feel the silent afternoons of our village, the desolate fields, and the warnings about not venturing out after sunset, all echoing in my ears. There was a time when my grandfather, Ian, undertook rigorous spiritual disciplines, learned the old craft, and in some matters became truly successful. When he had acquired enough knowledge to discern which problems required medicine and which needed a different unseen remedy, he returned to his village. Upon his return, he established a small practice separate from his home in a small outbuilding. That was his entire setup. If someone ill came to him, he would offer prayers. If they could afford to pay, they did. If not, he would help them for free. Slowly, people began to visit him for spiritual troubles as well. In the old days, the villages were sparsely populated. The paths were lonely, the fields stretched for miles, and traveling from one village to another felt like crossing into a world where everything in between had ceased to exist. We grew up hearing the warnings. Don't go to that particular spot in the afternoon. Don't go near the outbuilding after sunset. Never go into the far fields alone. People didn't say these things for no reason. There were always reasons. And then, one day, the very thing that had inspired those warnings came to pass. It was the season for the barley harvest. In the countryside, payment for labor is often made with grain, not money. A poor family had been hired to harvest a landowner's crop. Among them was a young girl. It was the middle of the afternoon. The girl wandered off into the tall stalks of barley for a few moments, perhaps to relieve herself or to find water. No one could say for sure. All they knew was that she didn't return after a few minutes. Then, suddenly, screams echoed from within the fields. People ran towards the sound, and what they saw was far from ordinary. The girl was on the ground, but not as if she had simply fainted. Her body was writhing with an unnatural strength. They say she had the strength of 10 men, and I'm not just repeating a phrase. There were 8 or 10 men physically holding her down by her arms and legs. Even then, she thrashed about with such force, it was as if her body was being controlled by something else entirely. The villagers were terrified. No one could understand how such a frail-looking girl could possess such power. At that moment, someone shouted, "Fetch old Ian." This doesn't look like a medical problem. When my grandfather arrived, he first looked at the girl, then at the crowd, and then cast his gaze across the fields. He spoke only one sentence. "She isn't ill. This is something else." The villagers quickly explained what had happened, that she had gone into the fields in the afternoon, that they had heard screams, and that this was her condition now. Grandfather Ian began to recite his prayers, but whatever had taken hold of her was not easily subdued. It was laughing, but not the laugh of a young girl. It was the laugh of a spectator enjoying a show. A voice came from the girl's mouth. "You can't do anything to me." The first day passed. With no effect, Grandfather Ian gave clear instructions. "Do not leave her alone for a second. Keep her protected. I need 2 or 3 days. I must go and perform my rituals. I first need to understand what kind of entity this is and where it has come from." You might understand this point. It's said that even these entities have their own clans and tribes. That was the path my grandfather was taking. First identification, then communication. 3 or 4 days later, my grandfather returned. The girl was brought before him. The crowd was even more frightened now because the news had spread throughout the region. As soon as the girl was seated, the same laughter returned, the same mockery, the same insolence. Grandfather Ian said, "Bring me a pen and paper." People didn't understand what he was about to do. The paper came, the pen came. Grandfather Ian began to write on the paper, slowly, line by line, as if he weren't writing a simple prayer, but someone's entire address. Then he held the paper up in front of the girl's face. That was the moment the atmosphere changed. The girl's body went rigid, the color drained from her face, and she began to scream. A scream so chilling that even the dogs in the fields fell silent. Amidst the screams, she started making threats. "If you harm me, I'll do this, I'll do that." Grandfather Ian didn't lower the paper. He said in a very calm tone, "I have reached the point where I know where you are from. I know which clan you belong to. Now, tell me, will you leave or not?" Then, after a few moments, it gave a reason, a strange reason, but the kind that such stories in the countryside are built upon. "I was sleeping in the bushes. She urinated on me." Hearing this, the villagers recoiled. The matter had now shifted from mere possession to one of revenge. Grandfather Ian tried to reason with it. "She is just a child. It was a mistake. She was working in the fields. Where was she supposed to find a washroom? Leave her now." But it was stubborn. "What will you do if I don't leave?" My grandfather picked up the same paper again. Below what he had written, he added another verse, then 2 more lines, and then showed the paper again. This time, the screams were louder than before, and the struggle was so intense that even the 10 men could barely contain her. Grandfather Ian said, "I do not wish to harm your kind, but if you do not listen, I will be forced to take action." Then he said, Bring me a box of matches." The moment the word matches was spoken, the girl truly lost control. Violent convulsions, screams, and then not her voice. My grandfather did not waste that moment. He said, "This is your final warning. If you do not leave, I will set this paper on fire and you will burn along with it." The people were astonished. No one knew what was written on the paper, but the entity knew, and that is why it was terrified. Finally, as my grandfather moved the paper closer to a flame, the girl's body went limp. She fell down, exhausted. After a few moments, she lifted her head and said, "All right, I know if this burns, I will die too. I am leaving." My grandfather said, "Give us a sign so we know you will not return." And then it replied, "You know that large wooden chest in your house for storing grain? The one that 2 or 3 men can't even move? As I leave, I will knock it over. That will be your sign." The people looked at each other. Some believed, some didn't. But a few minutes later, it happened. A loud crash, and that heavy chest had fallen over on its own. Her eyes were normal. Her breathing was normal, as if nothing had ever been wrong. This was the first incident I heard about, and a similar second incident made everything even more terrifying. Story 2. After the first incident, the village was peaceful for a while. But in the countryside, such events don't just end. They merely fall silent. People talk about them less, but the fear remains in their hearts. A few months later, in the neighboring village, another incident occurred. This time, the situation was different. A girl of about 17 or 18 suddenly fell ill. At first, her family thought it was a common illness, fever, weakness, restlessness, but gradually, her condition began to change. She would suddenly start screaming, then fall silent, and at times, she would thrash her arms with such force that it was impossible to hold her down. The family initially hid the true nature of the problem. They simply sent a message that their daughter was unwell and asked if my grandfather could come and see her. Grandfather Ian replied, bring her to my practice. But the real trouble began when they tried to transport her. In those days, cars and ambulances were not common. People used carts or bicycles to transport the sick. With great difficulty, they managed to get the girl onto a horse-drawn cart. Those who were there say that the girl's weight was no longer normal. It took 7 or 8 men to lift her. At first, no one paid much attention, but when it was time to move, the horse wouldn't take a single step forward. It would strain, then stop. They would try again, and it would sit down. The men were baffled. The girl didn't look that heavy, but it was as if her body carried not just weight, but a heavy burden. Finally, a second message was sent. "We can't handle her. You'll have to come yourself." Grandfather Ian went there himself. When he entered the house, the atmosphere was strange. The family members were speaking in whispers, as if a loud noise might anger something. The girl was sitting in a corner of the room, her head bowed. As soon as my grandfather approached, she looked up. Her eyes held the same thing he had seen in the first incident. Not anger, not pain, just a strange, stubborn defiance. Grandfather Ian began his recitations. This time, he didn't say much. Perhaps he already had an idea of the nature of the problem. After some time, the girl's body began to stiffen. Her breathing became rapid. Then, suddenly, she let out a loud laugh. The laugh echoed through the room, and the women of the house fled outside. This ritual continued for a long time. Sometimes she would become calm, and then suddenly she would let out a piercing scream. But this time, Grandfather Ian was in no hurry. He was observing every reaction, as if he was first trying to tire the entity out. Finally, after several hours, the girl fainted. When she regained consciousness, she was completely normal. She remembered nothing. For the villagers, this was the second major event. But for Grandfather Ian, it was perhaps a warning. Because after this, the course of his life was about to change. Story 3. My grandfather, Ian, was the only son of his parents. He had not wanted to marry. The reason was simple. The knowledge he had acquired came with its own dangers. His mentor had been clear with him, either leave this path or do not marry. The two cannot go together, but under pressure from his family, he got married. In the beginning, everything was fine. It was a large house with an open courtyard, a separate area for the animals, and the same simple village life. But after the marriage, small incidents began to occur. Incidents that would seem insignificant to outsiders, but were deeply unsettling for the family. Then, a year later, their first child was born, a daughter. A short while later, she passed away. This event shook my grandfather to his core. He remembered his mentor's words. He went to see him. The mentor said the same thing he had said before. These things do not leave you. When you are near, they remain quiet. When you are away, they bother your family. This thought settled deep in my grandfather's mind. But life does not stop. Sometime later, my grandmother, Elara, was expecting again. This time, a second daughter was born, and she was perfectly healthy. But now, my grandmother was afraid to be in the house alone. She never said it outright, but she felt something, especially at night. Then came the night that made my grandfather decide to change everything. In village life, night doesn't just mean darkness. Night means silence. A silence so profound you can hear the distant flow of water. And sometimes it feels as if someone is watching you. Our family's farmhouse was quite far from the village proper. It was near the canal, surrounded by fields, with a few rooms in the middle. There was an open courtyard, and towering over it, a great ancient oak tree. That tree was so large that even during the day, the shade beneath it was deep and dark. I saw that tree myself in my childhood, and honestly, even in broad daylight. Daylight, standing under it, gave you a strange feeling, as if the space wasn't empty. Staying there at night was not for everyone. But farm work is such that you cannot keep to a schedule. When it was your turn for the canal water, you had to be there, whether it was 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Because of this, my grandfather often had to stay the night at the farmhouse. My grandmother was now scared of being home alone. She would often say, "I'll come with you. I don't feel right here by myself." Gradually, it became routine that whenever he had to go to the farmhouse at night, she would go with him. They kept some food and supplies there. They would cook there, set up their charpoys, and spend the night. One night, it was their turn for the water. The weather was perfectly clear. A light breeze was blowing. The canal water flowed ceaselessly. Grandfather Ian finished his work. Grandmother Elara cooked dinner. The baby, who was then just a month or two old, was sleeping on a charpoy. The night slowly deepened. The leaves of the oak tree rustled in the wind, making a sound like soft whispering. Eventually, everyone fell asleep. My grandfather suddenly woke up. At first, he didn't understand why he was awake. Sometimes, a person wakes for no reason, but after a few seconds, he realized something was wrong. The charpoy next to him was empty. My grandmother wasn't there. The baby was gone too. A strange terror shot through him. He immediately got up. He looked around. There was no one in the room. Then his eyes fell on the small irrigation channel that ran a short distance from the charpoys. A woman was sitting there, crouched down, her head bowed, her hands in the water. My grandfather moved slowly towards her. His heart was pounding, but he kept going. When he got closer, his feet froze. It was my grandmother, but she was not sitting like a mother sits. Her hands were in the water, and she was slowly, deliberately pushing the baby down into the shallow stream. For a moment, my grandfather couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Then, as reality hit him, he lunged forward. He grabbed my grandmother from behind and pulled her back forcefully. In that same instant, the baby came out of the water. My grandfather's hands were shaking. He quickly picked up the baby, laid her on the charpoy, placed his hand on her chest, and breathed air into her mouth, trying to expel the water. Those few moments, which were probably only a few seconds, felt like hours to him. Then, suddenly, the baby took a breath. My grandfather collapsed onto the ground, as if all the life had been drained from him. My grandmother was lying on the ground, her eyes open, but she was doing nothing. No resistance, no sound. My grandfather recited a prayer and blew upon her. A few moments later, she lost consciousness. He carried her to the charpoy. A little later, when she came to, she asked in confusion, "What happened?" She didn't remember a thing, not a single moment. It was then that my grandfather knew for certain that this was no coincidence. It was the same chain of events that had been following him, and this time, the target was not him, but his family. Story 4. That incident was the most terrifying moment of my grandfather's life, and it was the night he made his final decision. After that night, my grandfather understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not a series of coincidences. In the previous incidents, the harm had been to others. But now, the matter had reached his own home. And after what he had seen that night, he could not take any more risks. As morning broke, he decided he would go to his mentor. When Grandfather Ian recounted the entire incident, his mentor showed no surprise, as if he had always known this day would come. He simply said, "I told you before, this path does not run parallel to an ordinary life. As long as you are present, they remain quiet. When you are away, they reach for your family." My grandfather remained silent. The mentor continued, "Now, the decision is yours. Either live your entire life with these things and put your family in danger, or release what you hold." The knowledge he had acquired was not common. People came to him, gave him respect. Their problems were solved. It was a form of power, and it is never easy for a man to let go of power. But the scene from that night kept replaying in his mind: the dark water of the channel, the baby in peril, and the empty eyes of his wife. He made the decision that any father would make. They say that afterwards, my grandfather slowly began to let it all go. The rituals, the practices, all the things through which he had entered that realm. He never explained the details to anyone, nor did he ever boast about his past abilities. He simply started spending less time at his practice. People continued to come, but he stopped meddling in spiritual affairs. After some time, his life did begin to return to normal. Peace returned to his home. My grandmother never experienced an incident like that again. The children grew up in a normal way, but one thing remained. My grandfather often felt that the entities hadn't disappeared completely. They had just moved further away. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes he would sit in silence, as if sensing someone's presence. But he never again took a step in that direction. Time passed, life went on, and then came the time when my grandfather departed from this world. After he was gone, when the family was sorting through his belongings, they found some things that surprised everyone. Large glass bottles, old papers and diaries. In those diaries were strange kinds of writings, numbers, diagrams, talismans, methods, things that an ordinary person could not even begin to understand. No one dared to touch those things. Most of the items were packed away, just as they were. The family believed that he had truly released it all, and that was why their lives had become normal later on. And perhaps that was for the best, because power does not always bring benefit. Sometimes its price is far too great. If he had remained on that path, perhaps his children would not be here today. I did not see any of these stories myself. This is all what I have heard from my elders, from my parents. It's possible some details have changed over time, but one thing everyone agrees on is that after he stopped, no such incidents ever happened in our family again. And Grandfather Ian lived the rest of his life like an ordinary man. But perhaps he could feel those things right up until his final moments. I hope you like this story. Please do share it on your channel. Thank you very much for sharing your story. Let's move on to another one. Story 5. Good evening, Adrian. I'm sharing this story because after what happened to me and my family, my faith in God became stronger than ever before. I don't want to reveal my name. I can only say that I am from an area near the city of Manchester. The strange events in my life began in my childhood, but at that time, I was too young to understand them. It was only later, when I grew up, that I realized there were certain things that the adults had dismissed, choosing to ignore them. This was back when I was living at my grandparents' house. It was a large old house, and there weren't many other houses around it. During the daytime, everything seemed perfectly normal. But as evening fell, the atmosphere of the house would change. A strange silence would descend, especially after sunset. It was during this period that the strange occurrences began, with my aunt Beatrice. She was incredibly beautiful, and everyone in the family adored her. At first, her health began to deteriorate unexpectedly. Sometimes it was anxiety, sometimes anger, other times a deep silence. The family initially treated it as a common illness, but slowly the situation grew more frightening. I still remember what happened one evening. It was dusk. A faint darkness was spreading across the sky. The lights were on inside the house, and everyone was busy with their own tasks. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from inside. When I ran towards the room, I saw my Aunt Beatrice sitting on the floor. But she didn't look like a normal person. Her